Greetings and thank you for joining me. I'm genuinely appreciative of your time, and if you decide to subscribe, it would truly mean a lot. Now, let's get started. Never in my life did I expect that the most impactful lesson I'd ever learn would come from watching my father lose half of everything in a divorce. That devastating moment turned out to be the exact reason I was able to protect myself years later, when after 15 years of marriage, my wife disappeared on a Sunday, only to serve me divorce papers the very next day. My name is Jimmy, and this is the story of how my wife and her new partner believed they'd struck gold, but ended up discovering I'd prepared for this moment all along. It all started on what seemed like an entirely uneventful Sunday. I was working in my home office, catching up on tasks, when my wife, Victoria, mentioned she was heading out to meet friends for lunch. We had been together for 15 years, and while the spark had faded in recent months, I never imagined she was planning to exit our life together. Over the previous year, Victoria had changed. After being laid off from her marketing job during the COVID-19 crisis, she made little to no effort to return to the workforce, even once the economy began to recover. Rather than looking for a new job, she focused her energy elsewhere. She increasingly acted as though the comfortable life we lived wasn't nearly enough. What she didn't realize was that our lifestyle wasn't sustained by massive wealth in my personal bank account. It was the product of disciplined financial planning and a deliberate business setup, all designed with my father's painful experience in mind. Back in 2010, my dad endured a divorce that wiped him out. He had poured 20 years into building a successful contracting business, but because everything was under his name, he had to give up half in the settlement. I remember vividly sitting across from him in his kitchen after the dust had settled. The man I had always viewed as a rock was visibly defeated, telling me how he had been forced to sell his trucks, his tools, everything he had worked so hard to create. That day, he gave me a piece of advice I'd never forget. Son, don't ever tie everything you own to your name. The person you love today might be the one trying to take it from you tomorrow. Those words stuck with me. So when my business partner Kevin and I launched our consulting firm in 2013, we structured it with protection in mind. Officially, Kevin held 60% ownership while I retained 40%. But the truth behind the scenes was far more nuanced. The majority of the seed money came from me, not as a capital investment, but as loans to the company, making me a creditor instead of a direct owner. Everything was legal, documented, and above board. The result? Our lifestyle looked affluent, but very little of that wealth was in my name. Victoria knew I ran a company, but she never fully grasped how our finances were organized. She saw the big house, the nice cars, the vacations, and assumed I was pocketing large personal profits. The truth was our business was thriving, especially after COVID, when companies needed help navigating the shift to digital. But thanks to my dad's wisdom, I never changed our protective structure, and that decision would end up saving me. What I didn't know was that Victoria had been planning her departure for quite some time, and I hadn't noticed the warning signs. In hindsight, they were obvious. She grew more resentful whenever I brought up budgeting or suggested we hold back on expenses. She constantly compared our life to that of her wealthier friends, questioning why we didn't live in a more prestigious neighborhood. She'd send me listings for luxury homes, pointing out how others lived. She made snide comments about our vehicles, saying successful people drove better ones, and whenever someone on social media posted about a lavish trip, she'd remark how they really knew how to live. I tried to explain that while our business did well, it required consistent reinvestment. To her, though, I came across as cheap. She began to believe I was hiding money, that I was secretly wealthy but unwilling to spend on the life she thought we deserved. In reality, most of our lifestyle was tied to the business. The house was owned by the company since I worked from home. The vehicles were leased through the business. Even many of our trips were planned around conferences or client meetings, allowing us to claim legitimate expenses. So while everything looked like it belonged to us, very little of it actually did, at least not in the way Victoria assumed. After our 13th anniversary, her emotional distance became more noticeable. She withdrew, guarded her phone, and seemed far more private than usual. She began going out more, often without telling me where or with whom. Whenever I asked what she was up to, she'd dodge the question or act irritated. I once suggested she refresh her LinkedIn profile, thinking she might be job hunting or networking. She snapped and said she didn't need my advice. Our conversations dwindled down to basic logistics, chores, schedules, finances. Attempts to talk on a deeper level were brushed off with complaints of stress or fatigue. The intimacy in our marriage had all but disappeared. She always had a reason: exhaustion, headaches, anxiety. I respected her boundaries, but it was clear something wasn't right. Still, I didn't suspect infidelity or a looming separation. I thought we were just navigating a rough patch. I was wrong. That Sunday, she seemed happier than she had in months. She spent more time getting ready, carefully styling her hair and makeup. Around noon, she told me she was heading to lunch with friends and would be back later in the day. I stayed in my office, focused on work, but by 7 p.m. she still hadn't returned. I sent a quick text to check in. It delivered, but there was no reply. By 10 p.m., concern began to set in. I called her phone, straight to voicemail. That wasn't like her. She always kept it charged. I called one of her friends, thinking maybe the lunch had turned into dinner and drinks, but her friend was surprised. She hadn't seen Victoria all day and didn't even know they were supposed to meet. When I mentioned that Victoria had said she was out with them, her friend sounded confused and concerned. That's when the truth started to dawn on me. She hadn't gone to lunch with friends. She had lied. I tried calling her again, this time from my work phone. It rang, but again straight to voicemail. That's when it hit me. She had blocked my number. And if she had blocked me, it meant she didn't want to be found. Panic set in. I started contacting other people we both knew, trying to locate someone who had spoken with her. No one had. Everyone was shocked to hear she was missing. By midnight, I was unraveling. I searched through her things for clues. That's when I noticed the subtle changes. Missing clothes, some jewelry, a few personal items. It wasn't everything, but it was enough to suggest she had packed intentionally. The rest of the night was a haze of fear and confusion. A part of me wondered if something terrible had happened. But deep down, I started to suspect the truth. She had planned this. She had blocked me, lied to me, taken what she needed and vanished. I checked our credit card transactions. Nothing out of the ordinary. I looked at her social media, but her privacy settings had changed. I was locked out from seeing anything new. Every exit had been sealed off. She had methodically removed my access to her world. On Monday morning, I came to the conclusion that I needed to file a missing person report for Victoria. I went down to the local precinct and explained the circumstances to the officer on duty. He took my statement and entered the details into their system. Though I could tell he wasn't entirely convinced that she had truly disappeared, perhaps suspecting she was simply avoiding contact, he asked whether there had been recent tension in our relationship. I admitted that things had been difficult between us, but not to the extent that would explain her vanishing. He reminded me that, from a legal standpoint, adults are free to leave of their own volition unless there's clear evidence of danger or wrongdoing. Often, he said, these cases boil down to private disputes between spouses. Even so, he assured me that they would reach out to hospitals and check recent accident reports just to be sure nothing serious had happened. He handed me a case number and told me to call if I uncovered anything new or if I began to suspect foul play. Leaving the station, I felt only a small measure of relief. While it was comforting that the authorities were now involved, unease still weighed heavily on me. I tried to redirect my focus back to work, but I couldn't concentrate. My mind kept circling back to why Victoria would leave without a word. Then, just after 4 p.m., the doorbell rang. When I opened it, a man in formal attire stood on the step, holding a sealed envelope. After confirming my name, he handed it over and said plainly, "You've been served," before walking off. Inside the envelope were divorce papers, along with a handwritten note from Victoria. The document cited irreconcilable differences and outlined her demands: spousal support, a split of marital assets, and coverage of her legal fees. Her message was brief and final. "Don't try to find me. I need a fresh start. This marriage is over. My attorney will take it from here." I stood there in disbelief, struggling to absorb what had just happened. Victoria hadn't disappeared because of an emergency. She had orchestrated everything. She had initiated divorce proceedings while still living under our roof, pretending everything was fine. She had lied about her whereabouts and deliberately staged her exit. Now, she was demanding financial compensation. Though I was relieved to know she was physically safe, I was shaken by the deliberate nature of what she had done. This wasn't a spontaneous decision driven by emotion. It was a calculated escape meant to cause the most damage. In the days that followed, I found myself replaying our recent conversations, searching for warning signs I might have overlooked. Yes, we had our issues, but nothing that suggested she was planning to disappear and dismantle our life behind my back. Roughly a week later, I consulted with a family law attorney my business lawyer had recommended. She carefully reviewed the divorce petition and asked in-depth questions about our finances, the structure of my business, and the overall state of our relationship. When she saw how the business had been organized, she immediately understood how this might influence the division of assets. She advised me to hire a private investigator, someone who could dig into what Victoria had been doing leading up to her departure. If she had been preparing this for months, there might be evidence that could affect the case. She also wanted clarity on where Victoria was now living and how she was supporting herself. I agreed and hired a specialist in domestic investigations. The investigator began her work right away. Within 2 weeks, she had uncovered concrete evidence that Victoria had been involved with another man for at least 6 months before filing for divorce. She produced photos, logs of their meetings, and confirmed that Victoria had moved in with him the same day she left our home. It was clear this was no impulsive move. It had been carefully planned. As devastating as the discovery was, it brought clarity. Victoria hadn't been overwhelmed or lost. She had chosen to leave in a way that gave her the upper hand legally, while concealing the affair. It was a tactical maneuver designed to protect herself and maximize what she could take from the marriage. My attorney used this information to craft our legal response. The affair, along with the manner in which Victoria left, would significantly impact her claims for financial support. I silently thanked my father for his foresight in helping me structure my finances years earlier. Victoria had likely expected to walk away with a substantial settlement, but the way everything had been legally and strategically set up meant she was in for a rude awakening. A few weeks later, the court scheduled our asset disclosure hearing. That morning, I met with my attorney outside the courthouse, preparing myself for what promised to be a tense and revealing session. When Victoria arrived with her new partner, their demeanor was upbeat, almost celebratory, as though they had already won. Her attorney submitted an aggressive list of demands, including alimony and a full split of all property. They clearly believed they were entitled to a significant payout. But when my lawyer began laying out the financial records, their confidence started to wane. What they saw were modest bank accounts, a paid-off 2019 Honda Civic, and personal items of limited value. The business was structured in such a way that none of its equity was personally held by me. As the numbers were presented, I noticed a shift in Victoria's expression. Her earlier smugness gave way to visible confusion. She whispered to her lawyer, clearly rattled. He objected, claiming the financial picture couldn't possibly be accurate. He argued that our lifestyle during the marriage suggested substantial hidden assets. But my attorney was prepared. She had all the documentation to back up our disclosures. Everything was properly filed and IRS compliant. As the judge reviewed the evidence, Victoria sat frozen, whispering urgently while her attorney struggled to reconcile the image of our past with the financial reality. When the judge asked if they had any concrete proof of concealed income, Victoria's lawyer had to admit they didn't. only assumptions based on lifestyle. My attorney calmly explained how the business had covered many of our shared expenses, making it appear we had more wealth than we actually did. The discussion then turned to the house. Victoria's legal team demanded it be awarded to her, but since it was owned by the business, it was never part of our personal estate. Meanwhile, we submitted evidence of her infidelity, asserting that her conduct should influence the final division of what remained. The judge concurred, determining that her portion should be significantly reduced. Her attorney requested a recess. After a brief consultation, they returned and accepted a settlement that was far less than they had anticipated. The judge denied Victoria's request for alimony, citing both her affair and her ability to support herself. Walking out of the courthouse, I was struck by a mix of emotions. Relief that I had shielded myself from financial disaster. Grief over the collapse of a relationship that had spanned 15 years. Victoria had gambled everything, believing she could walk away with both her freedom and a large share of what I had built. But the wealth she counted on didn't exist in the way she assumed. The same business structure she once dismissed as overly complex had proven to be my safeguard, just as my father had warned. By keeping assets within the business and maintaining clean, lawful financial records, I had avoided losing everything. Now that the legal battle is over, I've had time to reflect on it all, on the signs I missed, the lessons I learned, and how easily trust can be shattered when someone is intent on deception. That experience left an indelible impression on me. Although Victoria's betrayal and abrupt exit caused immense pain, they also unveiled parts of her nature I might never have recognized otherwise. She managed to uphold an elaborate deception for months, deceiving me daily and ultimately disappearing without a trace, all in pursuit of wealth that, ironically, turned out to be non-existent. Looking back, I'm grateful my father had once confided the hard-earned lessons of his own past, arming me with the awareness to defend myself against the kind of self-centered recklessness that can deeply damage another person's life. The legal aftermath of Victoria's vanishing only underscored the value of my father's warnings. She had assumed there was a substantial inheritance to secure, and when that illusion shattered, the fallout was immediate. That period of turmoil taught me something profound. Financial precautions aren't born out of cynicism or greed. They're a recognition of how uncertain human behavior and relationships can be. The person you commit your future to might one day become the adversary you're forced to confront in court. What I eventually came to realize was that my father's troubled history, especially the divorce that haunted him, was more than just a somber memory. It was a gift. His pain became a shield that spared me from repeating his mistakes, and for that, I'll always be indebted. Often, the deepest lessons don't arise from our own failures, but from witnessing the anguish of others. Being receptive to that kind of wisdom can mean the difference between collapse and endurance when life delivers its hardest blows. So, this part of the journey ends here. I'd love to hear your reflections in the comments. Thanks for being here, and if this story struck a chord with you, feel free to explore the other content on the channel. Until we meet again, be well.